Perception is not a casual process because perception is not a matter of principle involving subject along with object. There is no two. There is no duality to begin with. There is no inequality. Sight is one and objective in itself absolutely and could not be otherwise. There is no multiplicity or the many. Sight and mind are obstacles only because naturalist, the theorist, chooses to think of reference to reality as principle, therefore formed of two elements, sight and mind, instead of simply referring to the object and stating what he sees. Only if you see the necessity to attempt to make principle out of sight and speech as one, then you will see the requirement to include mind into reference. But at that point, you are not speaking of sight or even mind. Reference, truth, and the way of life are not principles or laws. So how can we decide between those pluralities, between the many, between knowledge and reality, as to which one is real and which one is derivative? How can we decide between inequalities, which of the unequal things is the real one? How to reconcile these opposing points of view? To correctly answer that, we must always remember the author and ask who is asking all these questions. Naturalism always hopes to be mistaken for objectivity. The answer is the theorist, the idealists, who formed a privileged position for the purpose of asking that question, which is to say for the purpose of rejecting objective reality in order to question it. The answer is there are no unequal things or opposing points of view, as those are points of view only within ideology privileging itself above reality. The ideology is naturalism, which is the privileging or equating incomplete idea of knowledge with the incomplete idea of nature, and then using that privilege as a point of reference to reality and a way of idealizing reality. Ideology of naturalism as such is referring neither to knowledge nor to reality, but to ideas and concepts, the attempted idea of knowledge and the attempted idea of nature. If and only if God above does not exist, then a hypothetical idea of knowledge and a hypothetical idea of nature may be taken for knowledge and nature. But since that conclusion is built on if, it is built on ideology, not on reality. To a person, there is no opposition. It is only to a mindset or to an ideology that those present themselves as the problem of the one and the many. It is only from the vantage point of the postulated naturalism that there exists duality or plurality or inequality, with the aim of describing reality without perspective. Naturalism sees itself as describing reality rather than ideology. Naturalism is a question, and naturalism is the questioning as the attempted reference to reality and the way of life, since it is always a question whether reality which excludes each and every human perspective is or would in fact be reality, let alone objective reality. What if objective, independent reality is made of perspectives? Then what would naturalism be removing if not reality itself? Naturalism suppresses that fact to be able to manufacture continuous hypothetical descriptions of such so-called reality, starting with environmentalism, humanism, liberalism, democracy, and other sub-ideologies. Outside of the ideology of naturalism, it is remembered that naturalistic descriptions are not descriptions of reality. They are counter-references, an attempted substitute for truth and soul, which ends in self-consumption. Take, for instance, the location of the Earth. Outside of the ideology of naturalism, the Earth is at the center of the world, created by God, to be fixed and unmoving. The location of the Earth clearly depends on the status of perspective. If men see themselves as persons or people or beings, rather than properties of the Earth, like they are portrayed in a theory, then their perception is not held to be outside reality, and therefore what they regard as the center of the world should be informed by them, not by theory. From the point of view of reality that includes perspectives treated as absolutely objective and real, the location of the Earth is determined by that point of view rather than by theory above the view. However, as naturalistic conceptions of the world spread, along with a new scientific method and the principle of autonomous human reason, reference to reality has taken subjectivist turn even further, where inconsistency of theory with theory passes for reference to reality, regardless of whether or not any theory corresponds to reality. And then, within such system of misreference, you can say the world itself was not created for anyone, nor for the purpose, but rather it somehow revolved out of the imaginary inequality gap between knowledge and reality, as if the naturalist could be said to be referring to reality in the first place. That is regarded as science within the ideology of naturalism. Or take another example, the shape of the earth. Why is it so important for naturalists to take a side on the issue of the shape of the earth? Well, it is not that naturalists care whether the earth is flat or spherical. What is of importance to naturalism is the status of the perspective, perception, observation, and sight. Remember, the primary purpose of starting natural science was to eliminate perspectives, points of view, and sight, even though natural science had never begun referring to sight. Thus, the attack on perception is the essence of naturalism. Naturalism is self-inflicted blindness. So, if it was the case that the earth is round, that would go to show the status of perception is not a being or reality, but rather their opposites, namely idea, ideology, concept or theory, a tenet of naturalism. And if that was the case, then naturalism as misreference could gain some evidence that it is actually a reference to reality or a language of reality. Naturalism is not a language at all. If, however, the earth is indeed flat, that would mean the status of perception is that of reality, being or person, which would discredit the ideology of naturalism as reference. The cost of siding with the notion that the earth is round is the status of your perspective. It also endorses the ideology of naturalism as reality. So before you take a stand on the issue, take a closer look at the scope of the battlefield, or else you will surrender the existential status of your sight and being. The naturalist takes a side on the issue because what is of importance to him is the status of perception, not the actual shape of the earth. And the reason the status of perception is important to him to undermine is because if he can claim that the status of perception is ideology, then he validates his ideology of naturalism as reference to reality, which is to say, as truth and as the way of life. What is at stake is the status of observation and of sight and speech expressed. Naturalist privileges half theory, authored by half theory over observation. The naturalist knows the earth is round but looks flat. Why privilege knowledge over sight? Privilege is the opposite of equality, law, or principle. From every terrestrial perspective, the earth is flat to the naturalist, yet he privileges the extraterrestrial vantage point in order to undermine the status of perspective. The naturalist claims he is aware of multiplicity of reports. The visual report tells him the earth is flat. The mind tells him it is spherical, so he concludes that the earth is round if and only if sight is idea or ideology. And since sight he regards as ideology, therefore he tells us the earth must be round. So how do we respond to that? First, we note that naturalist is referring neither to flat earth or round earth. He is referring to items in his ideology, the ever-attempted theory, and then denounces reality, the observational evidence, the real flat shape of the earth based on his incomplete ideology, or an ideology completed by another ideology. Outside of the ideology of naturalism, however, sight is reality, not ideology. Sight is nature. Perception, perspective, and point of view are reality, absolute, objective, pure reality, reality in itself. Within the reality in which sight is not ideology, the shape of the earth is flat. Naturalists counter this by claiming that their system of reference, called natural science, must be correct enough because it successfully predicts the so-called experience. To correctly calculate orbits of satellites, the earth must really be round. The answer is no. That calculation is just a useful model for practical purpose of a theorist, a model, not reality. But why is it useful? Asks the naturalist. If not because it correctly corresponds to the real shape of the earth. All of a sudden, objective reality does exist. When it serves the purpose of the naturalist, it is useful for naturalist purpose of questioning reality and replacing it with theory. Just because naturalist calculations may be consistent with their own theory within the ideology of naturalism is not yet evidence. They are statements about any reality. Calculations, after all, can be authored either by prior calculations and theories, or they can be authored by person, a being who instead of questioning, accepts reality. Naturalist calculations are not that. They are purposed to question and deny reality. Let us remember, the last thing the naturalism is willing to admit is that it has found the reality in itself, independent of perception, the real shape of the earth. If we listen carefully, we will notice that what naturalism is really saying is not that the earth is round, but that the earth from the vantage point of naturalism is round. Naturalism is not committing itself to the claim that round earth is the actual, real shape of the earth, given the skeptical assumptions naturalism started with. Naturalism is merely asserting that what is spherical is not the earth, but rather that within the changing world of appearances and inequalities of which the earth, other planets, and their shapes are just but one instance. This is a far cry from admitting that the earth without naturalism is round. Naturalism only claims that the appearance of the earth is round. Whether or not the appearance is actually round in itself, naturalism is not saying. How could it be otherwise? Naturalism started with rejection of the so-called phenomenal, changing world of appearances and inequalities, which naturalism does not want to accept as real. In fact, naturalism coined the phrase phenomenal in order to contrast it with something it called noumenal reality, or equality, which it supposed is the actual reality, the non-changing reality behind the so-called changing reality, where the earth is located in. Since naturalism does not regard a changing earth to be real earth, it is not describing real earth by its own admission. Nowadays, the ideology of naturalism has expanded and includes many other ideologies, sum total of which function as false reference to reality and the false way of life. Those other ideologies called environmentalism, humanism, liberalism, and democracy, and others. As a consequence, we refer to reality now from the vantage point of the sequence of all these historic ideologies, separating us from God, often without knowing that we do so, since we think of these deeply embedded ideologies as our being and soul, when in fact it is just the mind self-aware. Those naturalistic subjective references to reality betray themselves that they are not about reality. Many instances of that exist through history. We will list some of them now. We are told that by one system of counting, a man weighs 200 pounds, and by another 90 kilograms. So how much does he weigh really? What is the real one weight? It appears that one and the same thing, namely, the weight is a subject of two different numbers. So how or by what principle or law do we choose or privilege between them as real? The realists within naturalism answer by saying they are both true. I weigh 160 in pounds and 72 in kilograms. So what do I weigh really? What is the matter of fact? What is the one objective weight? Or as the naturalists ask it, what is the universal weight or the equal weight? The answer is, continues the realist, both 160 and 72 are true, depending on which system of measurement you are using. There is no problem or inconsistency or inequality whatever. So who is right, the realist or the anti-realist? The answer is they are both wrong. Realist, however, is closer to the truth, but he still yields territory to the anti-realists when he accepts as true that the anti-realist as naturalist is in fact referring to things or objects in reality, such as measurements, pounds, or kilograms. The anti-realist asks, what is the one real weight? The answer should be, you are not speaking about weight, but about a theory or idea of weight, within your larger theory ever incomplete. So it is not a weight, but rather idea of weight, located within your prior other idea, namely within the privileging incomplete idea of nature with the incomplete idea of knowledge, which in turn is located within privileging words with sounds of words, in order to deprive them of authors, and thus forge a gap revolting against reality called meaning. The abyss as the new way of referring to reality by equating sounds of words with sounds of words. As such, we do not need to choose between the opposing or unequal weights, because in reality the so-called opposing numbers do not exist. In reality, we always need only one metric for a purpose at a time. You are giving your weight in one and only only one metric at a time in reality. Any other does not enter reality. The author of the skeptical question is self-reference, yet the realists within naturalism answer the skeptic anti-realist as if the skeptic was not self-referentialist, but referring to nature. And how could it be otherwise when realist himself thinks that naturalism is not self-reference, but language about nature? The correct answer is, there is only one measuring system of interest to people in reality at a time. There is no two, no duality or inequality. The realist is failing to see that the anti-realist is not speaking about or referring to actual measurements, but to the attempted theories or concepts of measurements within his larger theory of naturalism. The realist is answering the anti-realist as if the anti-realist was genuinely speaking language, as if he was about to